All right, we're talking today about the indicative mood. You should have read Wallace pages 442 through 460 in preparation for today's discussion. All right, David, what was your question?
My question was, there's such an overwhelming amount of uses in the indicative.
Mm-hmm.
It almost makes it seem like, why are there any other moods? Why didn't they just try to reconfigure the other three moods within the indicative somewhere? It almost seems like there's no use for the other three moods.
Okay, so the question is, why, if the indicative can be used so versatilely, what do you need the other moods for? Well, typically what happens is that languages, as they evolve, move from greater specificity, where the categories are quite distinct and separate, and over time categories break down, start to overlap, start to replace, and you get a mess. A mess for a second language learner, not for a first language learner. Okay, so think, for example, of the English present indicative. Okay, we use it for declarative, and that's what it's supposed to be used for, and interrogative. We use it for conditionals. If I come, then you're going to have to let me play. Okay. We use it for future tenses. I'm coming. When are you coming? I'm coming tomorrow. Okay. That's the present tense used for the future. Okay. We use it to how else do we use the indicative? We use it as an imperative. You will clean your room. Okay. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay. So the future indicative in English becomes imperatival. So here's when I look at pages 442 and 443 and all these lists of uses, I don't think, oh my word, look at all those uses I'd have to memorize.
Okay.
I think I would never even have to think a single new thought to recognize declaratives, interrogatives, conditionals. Okay. Most of this stuff just, it's natural. It just rises right out of the language to me. Some things are unique. So the use of the future indicative for an imperative, well, that's actually because in the Old Testament, the future form is used in the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. And that's how the Hebrews communicated the negative imperative, lo plus the imperfect. Okay. So that comes over into Greek as ou plus the future indicative, and then that influences the use of the future indicative in Greek. Now, I'm not saying that it didn't occur in classical Greek. It did actually. They used the future for the imperative in classical Greek too. But there's an influence there.
It seems like there's a ton of overlap.
Yeah, and that's just
the nature of language.
Nature of language.
Now, when you said that looking at all these uses, you would think it would come natural to you, just right out of the language. Is that, you're talking about English or you're talking about Greek?
Well, I'm just talking about language in general. We never think, I'm getting ready to make an interrogative statement. An interrogative, how do I do that? We know how to ask questions. And we don't even use the word interrogative unless we're in school talking about grammar. Okay? The closest we get is the verb interrogate. Okay? So we'll just walk through here and see if that makes sense. I do want to look at what he says about a critique of shorthand definitions of mood. So on page 444, he notes that, let's see here, page 444, notes in the first section, some grammars speak of mood as having an objective correspondence to reality. So they call the indicative mood the mood of simple fact. Okay. And then he critiques that. The second kind of definition is an improvement, but it's still misleading. That is, we say that it indicates the speaker's perception of reality. Okay. But again, he critiques that because misinformation, sarcasm, hyperbole, fiction, dualistic worldviews could not be communicated if that's the only thing that was true. So there under 3, page 445, he provides a more detailed. The mood is the morphological feature of a verb that a speaker uses. Oh dear. Okay, so picking back up where we left off, mood is the morphological feature of a verb that a speaker uses to portray his or her affirmation as to the certainty of the verbal action or state. Okay, so I don't think that it had to be worded so technically. We could have just said mood is the portrayal of reality, and portrayal may or may not correspond.
It's all about presentation.
Yes.
Kind of like talked about like tense.
Yes. So mood choice is as much a matter of presentation as tense choice. But people tend to have to be more sophisticated to make use of the portrayal options of mood than they do of tense.
Yeah.
So, and this is, you see this in English as well, if somebody starts using the subjunctive, just the fact that they're able to speak in the subjunctive in English is an indication of educational sophistication.
Nobody knows what subjunctive is.
Right. So, now, there are certain things that I think anybody, we've learned Mother May I game, and well, I may be there, and that could and becomes a significant subjunctive helping word. It could be. That's possible. Okay. So.
But especially that if I were.
Right. Right. I was interested in Wallace's comparison of the semantics of mood, actuality versus potentiality, and cognition versus volition. I've always felt like the assignment of the imperative mood to potentiality didn't make sense to me.
So the imperative?
The imperative, yes. Because I've never been in a linguistic context where I thought that the potentiality of an action was in view when the imperative was given. Now, maybe the closest is when you're a parent and you tell your kid to do something and they say no. Okay. So I give an imperative: pick up your socks. No. But I still don't think, oh, I just used a mood form that has the least relation to actuality. Because its fulfillment is entirely dependent upon the volition of another person rather than my volition. Well, how is an optative any less dependent upon your volition, or any more dependent on your volition? An optative in which we make a wish or we pray to God. It's making a request. Okay, so is the imperative really more dependent on another's volition than the optative is? No, I don't see that.
So would you say the optative would be more in line as far as depending on somebody else's volition than the imperative? Because you can still give an imperative without somebody necessarily having to complete that.
So on the bottom of this chart here, I would have swapped optative and subjunctive and made optative much closer to the volitional side. Up here, in terms of potentiality, I would be inclined to not put the imperative on that continuum at all.
But isn't it still referring to potential action?
So obviously, Wallace put it there because he thought it referred to potentiality. And I'm telling you that from one standpoint, you could say, well, obviously the action isn't actual, it's only potential. And so I say that's true, and therefore it belongs on that continuum. From another standpoint, is potentiality a function of our thought process when we make use of imperatives? My answer is no, it's not a function of my thought process. I know the optative is, because you wish when you know something's highly unlikely, and we say, I wish.
Okay, so I think I see what you're saying.
So for potentiality to be in view, you're saying that's not necessarily the case when you make an imperative because it's inherently.
Well, you expect.
You expect.
Yeah, there's an expectancy. So in that sense, if we're going to put it on this continuum, we ought to put it closer to actuality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's only in rare cases that we give commands and have a question about whether it's going to occur or not.
Or, yeah, it's a possibility.
Whereas when I wish, I have a much greater doubt about the occurrence of my wish. So just offering you some alternative ways to think about what's going on there.
So how is Wallace saying that the imperative has anything to do with volition in that case? After listening to your reasoning as to why.
Well, the volition is not of the speaker, but of the listener.
Okay.
So I'm addressing your will when I say, get up. And your will decides I will get up or I won't get up. So volition is the primary target of the imperative mood, whereas cognition is the primary target of the indicative mood. I want you to, when I say something in the indicative, I want you to understand, I want you to think. Okay?
So he's saying then that the subjunctive, its primary target is potentiality.
Yes, in terms of potentiality versus actuality, if I say, I am going to the store versus I may go to the store. By saying may, I've moved it from actual to potential. I wish I could go to the store. Pushed it way out here on the end. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the distribution of the moods, you see the chart there with the frequency. And clearly, the indicative is by far the most common. Only 68 occurrences of the optative mood in the New Testament.
Does that mean that the occurrences of the optative are somewhat significant?
Yes, I think they're so that's what he's saying here on on this fifth point here under the chart. He says even when there is a choice between moods, the mood is not always in line with its general force. For example, in the language of prayer, when pronouncing a blessing such as "May God grant you," the optative is virtually required. Yet this does not mean that the speaker thinks of such a blessing as less likely to occur than if he used the subjunctive, or for that matter, the imperative, because you actually get the imperative used in prayer in Greek. So the first three requests of the Lord's Prayer, Elphetoi Vasilia, is an imperative. Let your kingdom come. And then he notes that prohibitions are often given in the subjunctive rather than the imperative. This doesn't mean that the speaker thought they would be heeded any more than had he used the imperative. So, as always, context and usage determine meaning, right? All right, go ahead.
So, the uses of the optative, like when Paul sometimes writes, say, "I wish that I could be with you," or whatnot. Is that when the optative is being used, or is he using?
It could be that there are also circumlocutions, like "Thelo," I desire, with an infinitive, to be present with you. So.
Well, even the indicative, one of you still remember? That mentions the potential, it's just used with the verbs
Mm-hmm.
of obligation, which desire, whatever.
Okay. Yes.
I think the optative is one that's harder because I don't have.
Well, I haven't had you read the stuff for the optative yet, so let's just hold off on discussing it in particular until we've done that reading. Did you have any questions about the specific indicative mood uses, whether declarative, interrogative, conditional, potential, cohortative?
It talks about classes of conditions.
Okay.
So classes of conditions are just like names given to certain instructions.
Yes. In the Bob Jones Handbook, in the back, set page 251, there's a discussion of conditional sentences, and there are 4 basic syntactical constructions. Those constructions are like this. We have the conditional particle E, which means if, plus the indicative mood in the protasis, followed by anything in the apodosis. Okay, and this is called first class condition because I think it's the most frequent. And here we have the condition assumed true for sake of argument. Second class is condition assumed false for sake of argument, and here you have E plus a past or specifically an imperfect or aorist indicative. Okay, and in this case, condition is assumed false for sake of argument. Now that's a pretty important difference, and you would certainly want to pick up on that. So when Jesus said, if they had known that he was the Prince of Glory, they would not have crucified him, he's using a second-class condition. If they had known, which we assume for the sake of argument, they did not know. Okay. Third class is the on plus the subjunctive. Oops. Subjunctive and the apodosis, and basically anything in the protasis. Oh, I forgot to indicate the apodosis here on the second class condition. Normally it's on plus, I just say past indicative. And this is often called future more probable. I think that's an unhelpful label for students to learn, because when they think, okay, on plus the subjunctive, future more probable, that means that anything is more, the protasis is more likely to happen than less likely to happen. Well, that may be the case in many instances, but it's not the case in other instances. And it's always the context, not the construction, that indicates the degree of likelihood. So I would prefer to call it a future probable condition, a future possible condition, or future potential condition, and the relative likelihood is a function of context. And then the fourth class condition is E plus the optative. And this is a future condition that is uncertain and unlikely to be fulfilled. Okay?
I wasn't sure if it was referring to I was assuming it was referring to a particular construction,
Yes.
not just a label of.
No. So, but there's no meaning in why one's called first, one called second, except they just numbered them and then they referred to them as 1, 2, 3, 4.
So thinking back to our 1 John exercise, I think we did with 1 John, when in chapter 2 he's talking about if someone were to say.
Right. So,
Anything.
1 John 2, 1.
Yes.
En tis amarte. So you have a third class condition.
Which was
A future possible condition.
future possible.
Now, what's the likelihood that someone will sin? Fairly high. But that's not a function of the grammar. That's a function of our knowledge of human fallibility. Okay. And then if we go down, for example, well, that's actually not a conditional statement. And it's a conditional statement in a non-conditional syntax. But chapter 1, verse 8, if we say that we do not have sin, future possible condition. So all of chapter 1, verse 6, verse 8, and verse 10, they all use third-class conditions.
But the reason why that's significant is not because of the grammar. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, it is significant. If John wanted to say, if someone is saying such and such, with the assumption that they are indeed saying it, he would have used the first-class condition.
Okay.
All right. But he chose the third-class condition for one of two reasons. It's a bit more rhetorically soft, okay? Or he was not wanting to affirm that in fact anyone was saying this, but raise a possibility and deal with it. Okay, we do this, right? A dorm RA knows something has happened and calls a meeting and says, now if someone were to, right? What are they doing? They're using the subjunctive, and everybody chuckles. Why do we laugh? Because they are talking possibility when we know it's actuality. But it's a rhetorical choice in order to make the statement less direct, right?
So if that's the case, is John saying that it's probable that someone would be saying,
Well, that's why I don't want to call the third class future more probable. I think it's a mistake to call it that. It ought to be called future possible. It's not necessarily probable, or even more probable than less probable.
And that construction itself doesn't say anything about likelihood.
No, it does not say anything about likelihood.
Gotcha.
Yeah, if they were fourth class, and it would be the
It's unlikely. It is saying something about likelihood. It's saying it's not likely.
So why would the fourth class say something about likelihood and not third class?
Well, why not? Do you have to have either more or less, or can you have possible without regard to more or less and one that has less?
second class is contrary to that.
Yes. Assumed to be false for the sake of argument.
So not necessarily.
Not necessarily false, but assumed false, yes.
Just like the first one is assumed to be true, not necessarily true.
Correct. Okay. Good question. Other questions?
Is there not a section in the handbook on
Because I'd have to look at the table of contents. I would expect that there is one. Maybe there's not. Looks like there isn't. Okay, that's all I have to say about the indicative. I didn't see anything particularly that stood out to me about his discussions of specific texts exegetically.
how exegetically significant is mood, or is it just a function of grammar that has to be there for it?
How exegetically significant is mood? It's kind of part of the linguistic background, framework that only becomes significant when people ignore it
Yes.
and say stuff that it doesn't allow. So,
For instance, like, take Romans 6, and you have Paul is saying all the
Indicatives.
versus the imperative.
Yeah.
If somebody were to say, well, that's not an imperative or indicative, this is subjective.
or somebody says, you know, what we need to do is we need to crucify ourselves. You need to crucify your old man. And then I said, but Paul used the indicative mood and he said the old man was crucified. So that means he's portraying this as actually happening, having happened in past time. And if it has happened, it doesn't need to happen again. What's not needed is another crucifixion, but an awareness of the implications of what is true. Yes.
Okay. So it's not
This is particularly problematic in holiness theology, where you get people saying, you know, what you need to do is die to self. So, well, actually, I already did that. I did that when I got saved. What needs to happen is I need to live out the reality of my death with Christ and do that through faith and the empowerment of the Spirit.
So there'd be more mistake made in the sense of ignoring what's there as
Mhm.
opposed to interpreting.
I think so.
It seems like when you talk about the causal OT,
Which page?
of course it
Okay.
says that sometimes there are some like we need to make a difference between declarative OT and causal.
Causal?
Yeah.
OT?
Wasn't that something that Carson was talking about? Like the translation sometimes as like since.
Well, I think what Carson was saying was, if I'm remembering correctly, I didn't bring him with me today, that it was fairly common in earlier grammars and in commentaries based on them to say that the first class condition is asserting that a thing is true, so you can read it not as if, but as since. So, for example, in Colossians 3:1, it says, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above. And the preacher says, this is a first class condition, and we can read it since you have been raised with Christ. And I say, well, yes, it's true that Paul is assuming they've been raised with Christ. But he also chose to put that in a conditional syntax for its rhetorical effect. There's quite a big difference between me saying to you, since you're in second year Greek, you need to do so-and-so. Or I look at you and I say, if you're in second year Greek, you need to do so-and-so. Well, you're like, if I'm in second year Greek, well, of course I'm in second year Greek. So I actually elicit a response by that rhetorical choice that would not be there if I used since.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can underread things if you don't recognize the rhetorical dimension.
It almost seems like too that the second option is not as forceful. If you were to say, well, if you are, I'm not saying if you are, I'm saying if you are, then that would, like you said, elicit a response.
But it grabs your attention more,
Yes.
a lot more, especially if they say, if you are this, you're like, well, I am.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't you know?
And so that's one kind of underreading. Another kind of misreading would be, Satan says to Jesus in the wilderness, if you are the Son of God. And people misread that and say, well, Satan's essentially calling into question the deity of Christ. No, it's a first-class condition. It's assumed to be true for the sake of argument.
Right.
It may be Satan used that construction for its rhetorical effect, but it's certainly not a denial of the assumption.
That makes sense.
On page 456, under clarification and semantics, Wallace notes that in many instances of indirect discourse, there's no original statement that needs to be recast. Indirect, and the last sentence, indirect discourse then should not be taken to mean that there is always an underlying direct discourse. So this is the kind of thing that grammar guards you against. I don't look at indirect discourse and think to myself, wow, big exegetical payload here. But I hear somebody else say something about it, and I'm like, no, wait a minute. That doesn't imply that. Because I know how it's used, I'm able to identify misuses. And so there were published in 50s, 60s, 70s a series of books that were basically kind of like gold nuggets from the Greek New Testament, or pay dirt from New Testament Greek. And I noticed that those books have essentially disappeared from usage. And the reason is that they were classic examples of all kinds of logical, linguistic, and grammatical fallacies. Okay. Overreading, underreading, misreading. And when you get to know more about Greek, you're just like, that's a nifty idea, and that may be easy to preach, but it just ain't so. Mm-hmm. So I had a prof in grad school who liked to say, exegetical significance and niftiness are inversely proportional. Or exegetical accuracy and niftiness are inversely proportional. That's what he said. Okay. So the more nifty it is, the less likely it is to be true. Why? Well, because language generally runs on the tracks of normalcy, not on the tracks of niftiness. Right. So I can't ever remember, other than that when things are in contrast, like the indicative imperative of Romans 6, I can't ever remember making a particular exegetical point and saying, now this verb happens to be indicative. Even the fact that, for example, Paul's prayer in 1 Thessalonians 5:23 is the aorist optative, I don't make any point out of the optative except to say, well, the optative is used for prayer, and that's what he's doing here. He's praying. Right. Nothing surprising. Right. It certainly would be illegitimate to say, well, the optative is the farthest from reality. This is a long shot, Paul's praying here. I really wish, I know it's not likely to happen, but I really wish God would sanctify you entirely. Okay. Well, that would be the kind of thing that a person who's looked at Wallace's chart about actuality, potentiality, sees the optatives out here on this end, sees that that's an optative and says, oh, Paul really doesn't expect God to answer this prayer. Mm-hmm. Say, whoa, wait a minute. Read the next verse. Faithful is he who called you, who also will do it. Right. Future indicative. Right. So, as always, context is so crucial. And it's when we atomize things down to these little components and then load a whole bunch of data in on that little component. Right. You're almost always doing an injustice to grammar. Yeah. While at the same time, so people have learned that lesson really well in scholarly circles, and they've gone to the other extreme. They've gone to the extreme of saying things like Moisés Silva says, which I'm not even in Moisés Silva's class as a scholar, and I know that. But he overreacts when he says that a distinction between a present and an aorist is too fine a distinction for a Greek speaker to catch. I'm like, well, the guy who was writing it chose the aorist for this and the present for that. So if he was able to make a discernible choice, why couldn't you expect an audience to recognize that a discernible choice? And why does that have to become a fine distinction? Okay.
Well, I think if it's such a fine distinction that they could have never used in any type of physical pattern.
Right? Or that they wouldn't make arguments hang on them. But instead, what we seem to see quite clearly in 1 John is that the argument of the book as a whole hangs on this present tense versus aorist disjunction. So you can overdo it and you can underdo it. And the solution to all grammatical ills is drink deeply, read broadly. Right? The more you read, the broader you see. Things that looked anomalous with a little tiny reading look less and less anomalous with broader readings. And you can't be a completely broad in everything, right? So I haven't read through the Septuagint from start to finish in Greek. I've read parts here or there. I read the Septuagint various times. I was reading it just today in chapel. But I recognize, I've learned as a scholar to know when I am starting to say something that's broader than my database will support. And that's when it takes humility. Maybe what you want is the big broad statement because it supports your point. But humility says, well, actually, I haven't read enough to make that kind of statement. So I can't be that broad. I've got to narrow it and constrain it down to what I actually know. That kind of integrity is crucial, particularly since pastors are allowed to pontificate. And if they pontificate beyond their database, then God will be sure their sin will find them out sooner or later. And I have been guilty of pontificating past my database at times, and I repented and have make it a conscious effort to make sure I stay within my bounds.